Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is Thomas Garcia, and I am 76 years old now. But the events I'm about to recount happened to me on October 15th, 1992, when I was just 44. It's a story that has haunted me for over 3 decades, one that I've rarely shared due to fear of disbelief or ridicule. But as I approach the twilight of my life, I feel compelled to put it down in writing, to leave a record of what I experienced in those fateful days in the Pinolino Mountains of Arizona. Back then I was a different man, younger of course, but also more carefree and adventurous. I worked as a middle manager at a paper company in Phoenix, a job that paid the bills but did little to satisfy my wanderlust. To combat the monotony of my 9-to-5 existence, I developed a passion for solo camping trips. There was something about the solitude of nature that rejuvenated my spirit in a way nothing else could. My vehicle of choice for these excursions was an old Winnebago, a beat-up 78 model I'd bought second-hand a few years back. It wasn't much to look at, with its faded beige exterior and the occasional rust spot, but it was my ticket to freedom. I'd lovingly restored much of the interior, replacing the worn-out upholstery and fixing up the kitchenette. It wasn't fancy, but it was home away from home. For months, I'd been planning this particular trip to the Pinolino Mountains. It's a beautiful spot, not too popular with tourists, which is just how I like it. I'd saved up my vacation days, squirreling them away like a miser hoarding gold coins. By the time October rolled around, I had a full week to spend in the wilderness. My preparations were meticulous. I stocked up on canned goods, filled a cooler with enough beer to last the week, and then some, and packed a stack of old paperback novels, mostly westerns and mystery thrillers. I made sure my first aid kit was fully stocked and double-checked all my camping gear. I even splurged on a new sleeping bag, anticipating the chilly autumn nights in the mountains. Originally, my buddy Carl Benton was supposed to join me. We'd been friends since high school, and he shared my love for the outdoors. We'd been on countless camping trips together over the years, swapping stories around the campfire and solving the world's problems over cans of cheap beer. But a week before we were set to leave, Carl called with the news that his wife, Linda, was expecting their first child. She was having a difficult pregnancy, and Carl, understandably, didn't want to leave her alone. "I'm sorry, Tom," he'd said over the phone, his voice a mixture of excitement and regret. "You know I'd be there if I could, but—" "Don't sweat it, Carl," I'd replied, trying to hide my disappointment. "Family comes first. We'll catch the next one together." So on the morning of October 12, 1992, I set out alone in my trusty Winnebago. The drive from Phoenix to the Pinolino Mountains took about 4 hours, but I was in no rush. I took my time, enjoying the changing landscape as urban sprawl gave way to desert, and eventually to the pine-covered foothills of the mountains. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached my destination, a secluded campsite I'd discovered on a previous trip. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a bubbling creek nearby. I parked the Winnebago, took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, and felt the stress of city life begin to melt away. That first evening, as I sat by my campfire nursing a cold beer, I had no idea of the terror that awaited me in the days to come. If I had known, would I have turned back? Would I have fled to the safety of civilization? I'd like to think not, that the man I was then would have faced the unknown with courage. But the truth is, I don't know. What I do know is that the events that unfolded in that quiet mountain clearing would change me forever, leaving me with questions that have haunted me for over 30 years. The first couple of days of my camping trip were nothing short of idyllic. I fell into a comfortable routine, waking with the sun, brewing a pot of strong coffee over the campfire, and spending my mornings exploring the surrounding wilderness. The Pinolino Mountains in autumn were a feast for the senses. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. The trees were ablaze with red and gold leaves, and the only sounds were the rustling of wind through the branches and the occasional call of a bird. I'd spend hours hiking the mountain trails, my trusty Nikon camera around my neck, capturing the beauty of my surroundings. Sometimes I'd bring along my fishing rod and try my luck in the creek that ran near my campsite. I wasn't much of an angler, but I managed to catch a couple of decent-sized trout, which I cooked over the fire, savoring the taste of my own little victory against nature. In the evenings, I'd settle into my folding chair by the fire, a beer in one hand and a dog-eared Louis L'Amour novel in the other. As darkness fell and the stars came out, I'd look up at the vast expanse of the night sky, marveling at the Milky Way stretching across the heavens. It was in moments like these that I felt truly at peace, connected to something larger than myself. But on the third night, October 15th, things started to change. I remember the date clearly because it was the anniversary of my father's death, and I'd spent some time that evening reminiscing about him, wishing he could have seen this beautiful place. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick and lost in thought, when I heard something rustling in the bushes behind me. At first I didn't think much of it. The woods were full of life after all, and I'd seen plenty of deer and raccoons during my hikes. But there was something about the sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was too deliberate, too heavy to be a small animal. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the underbrush, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to turn back to the fire, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something large had darted behind a tree, just at the edge of my vision. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the night. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight into the woods. The shadows seemed to dance and shift in the unsteady light, but I saw nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's what I heard." After a few minutes of peering into the darkness, I returned to my chair, feeling foolish. "You're letting your imagination run wild, old man," I muttered to myself, taking a long swig of beer. But try as I might, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned in early that night, locking myself in the Winnebago and drawing all the curtains. It took me a long time to fall asleep, and when I did, my dreams were troubled, filled with shapeless shadows and the sound of heavy footsteps. The next morning, I woke to a beautiful crisp autumn day. The events of the night before seemed silly in the bright light of day, and I chided myself for getting spooked over nothing. But as I stepped out of the RV, stretching and breathing in the cool mountain air, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There in the soft earth around my campsite were footprints, but these were like no footprints I'd ever seen before. They were large, much too big for a person, with long, almost finger-like toes. My first thought was that it must be a bear, but I'd seen bear tracks before, and these were different. The shape was all wrong, more elongated, almost human-like, but grotesquely distorted. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and there, to flee back to the safety of civilization. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to adventure and mystery, was intrigued. What could have made these tracks? What kind of creature was out there in the woods? In the end, curiosity won out over caution. I took out my disposable camera and snapped several photos of the tracks, thinking they'd make for an interesting story to share with Carl when I got back. Then, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, I set out to explore the area, determined to find some explanation for what I'd seen. Little did I know I was taking the first steps down a path that would lead me into the heart of a mystery and a terror beyond anything I could have imagined. As the day wore on, I found myself unable to shake the unease that had settled over me. The strange footprints I'd discovered that morning haunted my thoughts, their impossible shape defying any rational explanation. I tried to distract myself with my usual activities, hiking, reading, tending to my campsite, but my mind kept circling back to those tracks and the rustling I'd heard in the night. That evening I decided to stay closer to the RV. I told myself it was because I was tired from my morning hike, but deep down, I knew it was fear keeping me tethered to the relative safety of my campsite. I fired up the small propane grill I'd brought along and cooked some hot dogs, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. As I sat in my folding chair, attempting to lose myself in one of the Western novels I'd brought along, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear a snap of a twig or the crunch of leaves from the surrounding woods. Each time I'd look up, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything out of the ordinary. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. As darkness fell, I built up my campfire, taking comfort in its warmth and light. But as the night deepened, so did my sense of unease. The woods seemed different somehow, the familiar sounds of nocturnal animals conspicuously absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard it again. That same rustling sound from the night before. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the circle of light cast by my fire. My heart racing, I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining the beam towards the source of the noise. For a split second, no more than the blink of an eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of two glowing eyes reflecting the light of my flashlight. They were set high off the ground, much higher than any animal I knew of, and they seemed to shine with an unnatural, almost intelligent light. As quickly as I'd seen them, the eyes disappeared, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the pounding of my heart and the cold sweat on my brow told me it had been real. Whatever was out there in the woods, it was no ordinary animal. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, my hunting knife close at hand. I kept the fire burning high and bright, hoping its light would keep whatever was out there at bay. Sleep was out of the question. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me jumping, my eyes straining to penetrate the darkness beyond my little circle of light. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I'd made it through the night. But as the shadows retreated and I surveyed my campsite in the growing light, I saw something that made my heart sink. There, in the soft earth at the edge of the clearing, were more of those strange, elongated footprints. Whatever had been watching me in the night had come close, terrifyingly close, while I'd sat there blind and vulnerable in the firelight. I knew then that I couldn't stay. Every instinct was screaming at me to pack up and leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I stood there staring at those impossible footprints, a different impulse took hold. I'd come here seeking adventure, hadn't I? And now, for better or worse, I'd found it. With a mixture of fear and determination, I made a decision. I wouldn't run, not yet. Instead, I would try to uncover the truth behind what was happening in these woods. Little did I know, this decision would lead me down a path of discovery and terror that would change my life forever. After a sleepless night, I spent the morning debating my next move. Part of me, the rational, self-preserving part, was urging me to pack up and leave, to put this whole unsettling experience behind me. But there was another part, driven by a mixture of curiosity and stubborn pride, that couldn't bear the thought of leaving without answers. In the end, curiosity won out. I decided to explore the area where I'd seen those glowing eyes the night before. I packed a day bag with water, some trail mix, my camera, and my hunting knife. As an afterthought, I also threw in a can of bear spray. I knew deep down that whatever was out there probably wasn't a bear, but the weight of the can in my pack was oddly comforting. I set out mid-morning, the autumn sun climbing high in a clear blue sky. The woods were beautiful, the trees resplendent in their fall colors, but I found it hard to appreciate the scenery. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig had me on edge, my eyes constantly scanning the forest around me. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The ground was soft from recent rain, and those strange, elongated footprints were clearly visible. They led away from my campsite, deeper into the woods. With my heart in my throat, I began to follow them. For about an hour I tracked the footprints through the forest. They seemed to meander aimlessly at times, circling back on themselves or veering off in unexpected directions. But gradually I realized they were leading me up a gentle slope, away from the creek and into a denser, older part of the forest. The trees here were massive, their trunks gnarled and twisted with age. The canopy above was so thick that little sunlight penetrated, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air felt different here too, heavier somehow, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Just as I was considering turning back, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. There, nestled in a small clearing, was an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, maybe decades. The windows were shattered, jagged shards of glass clinging to rotted frames. The door hung crookedly from rusted hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But I'd come too far to back out now. I had to know what secrets this place held. The interior of the cabin was a scene of decay and abandonment. A thick layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by the small animal tracks that crisscrossed the floor. What little furniture remained was broken and rotting. A collapsed table, the remnants of what might have been a chair, a rusted metal bed frame. But it was the far wall that truly caught my attention. Carved into the wood were strange symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They didn't resemble any alphabet or writing system I was familiar with. Instead, they seemed almost organic, twisting and intertwining in complex patterns that hurt my eyes to look at for too long. I pulled out my camera and began snapping pictures, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but I knew it was important. These carvings, this cabin, they were connected somehow to the creature I'd glimpsed in the night. I was sure of it. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, partially hidden under a pile of moldy leaves and debris, was the edge of what looked like a trap door. My heart raced as I knelt down to clear away the detritus. Sure enough, there it was, a wooden trap door, its surface worn smooth by time and use. For a moment I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, warning me of the dangers that could lie below. But my curiosity, that same driving force that had led me this far, wouldn't let me walk away. With trembling hands, I grasped the iron ring set into the wood and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a yawning darkness below. The musty smell of damp earth and decay wafted up, making me gag slightly. I shone my flashlight down, revealing a crude ladder descending into a small earthen chamber. Taking a deep breath to steel my nerves, I began to climb down. The ladder creaked ominously under my weight, but held. As I reached the bottom, I swept my flashlight around, taking in my surroundings. The chamber was small, no more than 10 feet across. The walls were earthen, reinforced with old, rotting timbers. But it was what was in the center of the room that made my blood run cold. There, occupying most of the floor space, was a large stone altar. Its surface was stained dark, and I didn't want to think too hard about what might have caused those stains. More of those strange symbols were carved into its sides, seeming to writhe and twist in the unsteady beam of my flashlight. On the walls, crude paintings depicted scenes that turned my stomach. They showed grotesque, misshapen figures engaged in what looked like ritual activities. And towering over these figures in each scene was a larger entity, its form indistinct but unmistakably menacing. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving across the floor of the cabin above me. Panic seized me. I quickly switched off my flashlight, plunging myself into total darkness. I pressed myself against the earthen wall, hardly daring to breathe as I listened to the movements above. The footsteps crossed the cabin slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something. They paused near the trapdoor, and for a heart-stopping moment, I was sure it was about to open. But then they moved away, crossing back to the cabin door. I waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. When I was sure the coast was clear, I cautiously made my way back up the ladder, my every movement painfully slow and quiet. The cabin was empty when I emerged, but I didn't linger. I ran, faster than I'd ever run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that accursed cabin as possible. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was setting. I was scratched, bruised, and utterly exhausted, but I didn't stop to rest. I threw my belongings haphazardly into the Winnebago, not caring about organization or damage. Within minutes I was on the road, driving perhaps a bit too fast down the winding mountain paths. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Phoenix hours later that I finally allowed myself to relax. As the familiar lights of the city came into view, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe. I had escaped. But as I drove through the quiet suburban streets towards my home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The things I'd seen, the mysteries I'd uncovered, they wouldn't simply disappear because I'd left them behind in those mountains. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that someday I would have to return. Someday, I would have to face the truth about what lurked in the shadows of the Pinolino Mountains. The entity I'd come to think of as the Hightail, a name that came to me in my nightmares in the weeks that followed, wasn't finished with me yet. As I pulled into my driveway, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon, I made a silent vow. I would prepare. I would research. And when the time came, I would be ready to uncover the full truth of the Hightail, no matter the cost. Little did I know then how high that cost would be, or how deeply the mystery of the Hightail would come to define the rest of my life. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. It's been over 3 decades since that fateful camping trip, and not a day goes by that I don't think about what happened in those woods. I've spent years researching, trying to find any information about the strange symbols I saw, or the creature I glimpsed. I've reached out to historians, anthropologists, even paranormal investigators, but answers remain elusive. I did go back to the Pinolino Mountains several times over the years, but I never found that cabin again. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, taking its secrets with it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if it was all just a vivid hallucination brought on by fear and isolation. But then I look at the photos I took, the footprints, the symbols on the cabin wall, and I know it was real. I've heard whispers over the years, stories of other encounters in those mountains, hikers gone missing, strange sightings reported by campers, but nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, there, that proves what I saw. As I sit here now, an old man nearing the end of his days, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever know the truth. What was the Hightail? Where did it come from? And why did it let me go that night when it could have easily caught me? These questions haunt me still, but I take comfort in knowing that by sharing my story, I might inspire others to look deeper, to question the world around them. Because if there's one thing I've learned in all these years, it's that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we could ever imagine. And somewhere out there, in the deep dark woods of the Pinolino Mountains, something is waiting, watching, biding its time. The Hightail, or whatever it truly is still out there, and someday someone will uncover the truth. I only hope they're more prepared for what they find than I was. This is Thomas Garcia signing off. Remember, the truth is out there. You just have to be brave enough or foolish enough to look for it. My name is Michael Martinez, and I am 71 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 14th, 2003, but its repercussions have echoed through the years, haunting me to this day. I've always loved camping, ever since I was a kid growing up in the suburbs of Denver. There's something about the quiet of the wilderness, the crackle of a campfire, and the stars overhead that just feels right. It's a connection to nature that I've cherished all my life. So when I finally retired from my job as a high school history teacher and bought myself a modest RV, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I'd been saving up for years, dreaming of the day when I could hit the open road and explore the great outdoors at my own pace. The RV wasn't anything fancy, a 2000 Winnebago Adventurer, 35 feet long, with a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and enough space for me and a friend or two. It was perfect for what I had in mind. I decided to take it out for a week-long trip to a spot I'd found while researching online, a secluded area near the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. It was about a 6-hour drive from my home in Denver, but I figured it would be worth it for the solitude and natural beauty. I didn't want to go alone, though. As much as I loved the idea of solo camping, at my age, it seemed wise to have someone along, just in case. That's when I thought of my old friend Dave Whitman. We'd been thick as thieves back in college, roommates all 4 years at the University of Colorado. After graduation, life had taken us in different directions, me into teaching, him into accounting. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, but it had been a good 5 years since we'd last seen each other face to face. I gave Dave a call on a whim, not really expecting him to be free or interested. To my surprise and delight, he jumped at the chance. "Mike, old buddy," he'd exclaimed over the phone, his voice warm with nostalgia. "A camping trip? In an RV? Hell yes, I'm in. When do we leave?" We set the date for July 14th, a Monday. I figured leaving early in the week would mean fewer crowds at the campsite. The night before our departure, I barely slept. It wasn't just excitement keeping me up. There was a strange sense of anticipation, almost foreboding, that I couldn't quite shake. I chalked it up to pre-trip jitters and the natural anxiety that comes with age. The morning of the 14th dawned clear and bright. I was up before the sun, double-checking my supplies and making sure the RV was in good shape. I'd stocked up on all the essentials. Plenty of food, water, first aid supplies, and of course, beer. Can't go camping without beer after all. Dave arrived at my place around 5 a.m., right on time. He looked good for 69, a little heavier than in our college days, his hair more salt than pepper, but his eyes still had that mischievous twinkle I remembered so well. "Ready for an adventure, Mikey?" He grinned, using the old nickname from our university days. I laughed, feeling some of my anxiety melt away. "You bet, Davy boy. Hop in, we've got a long drive ahead of us." As we pulled out of my driveway, the sky was just beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn. The streets of Denver were quiet, most of the city still asleep. It felt like we were embarking on a secret mission, sneaking away while the world slumbered. The drive was pleasant, filled with catching up and reminiscing. Dave told me about his grandkids, showing me pictures on his flip phone. I filled him in on my life since retirement, the volunteer work I'd been doing at the local library, the garden I'd started. It was comfortable, easy, like no time had passed at all. As we crossed into Wyoming, the landscape changed. The rolling plains gave way to more rugged terrain, hinting at the mountains to come. We stopped for lunch at a small diner in Casper, splitting a plate of biscuits and gravy that was so good it nearly brought tears to our eyes. "Just like Mom used to make," Dave said, patting his stomach contentedly. It was mid-afternoon when we finally reached our destination. The turnoff from the main road was easy to miss, just a small dirt track leading into the trees. I navigated the RV carefully, mindful of the uneven ground and low-hanging branches. After about a mile, the trees opened up into a small clearing next to a burbling creek. It was perfect, secluded, beautiful, with plenty of flat ground for the RV and our campsite. "Will you look at that?" Dave whispered, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The creek sparkled invitingly, and in the distance we could see the peaks of mountains rising against the sky. We set about making camp, falling into an easy rhythm. Dave set up the awning and outdoor furniture while I got the inside of the RV sorted. By the time the sun was setting, we had a cozy little setup. 2 camp chairs by a freshly dug fire pit, the RV providing a comforting presence at our backs. As night fell, we sat by the fire, cracking open our first beers of the trip. The stars came out, more than I'd seen in years. Away from the city lights, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds. "To old friends and new adventures," Dave said, raising his beer in a toast. I clinked my can against his, smiling. "To old friends and new adventures." We sat in companionable silence for a while, just enjoying the night and each other's company. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing up into the dark. In the distance, an owl hooted softly. "You know," Dave said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "I'm glad you called me, Mike. I needed this. Getting away from it all, I mean." I looked over at him, noting the lines of stress around his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "Everything okay, Dave?" He sighed, taking a long pull from his beer before answering. You know how it is. Work's been stressful. The firm's talking about downsizing, and at my age, well, let's just say I'm not feeling too secure." I nodded sympathetically. Even though I was retired, I remembered all too well the stress of work, the constant worry about job security. I'm sorry to hear that, Dave. Is there anything I can do? He shook his head, smiling ruefully. Nah, but thanks for asking. Just being out here, away from it all. It helps, you know. Puts things in perspective. We lapsed back into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As I stared into the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond our little circle of light. I told myself it was just my imagination, the natural wariness that comes from being in an unfamiliar place. If only I had known then what I know now. If only I had listened to that little voice of warning in the back of my mind. But I didn't. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to too many horror movies and an overactive imagination. As we doused the fire and headed into the RV for the night, I had no idea that our peaceful camping trip was about to take a turn into territory darker and more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The horrors that awaited us in the coming days would change our lives forever, leaving scars that would never fully heal. But for that night at least, we slept peacefully, lulled by the sound of the creek and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. It was the last truly restful night we would have for a long, long time. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I woke early, as I often do these days. The habits of a lifetime of early rising for work are hard to break, even in retirement. I lay in my bunk for a while, listening to Dave's soft snores from the other end of the RV and the cheerful songs of birds outside. Eventually, I got up, careful not to wake Dave. I put on a pot of coffee and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. The clearing looked different in the early light, softer somehow, draped in tendrils of mist that rose from the creek. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed something odd. Near the edge of our campsite, where the clearing met the dense forest, several branches had been broken off a small tree. They hung at odd angles, their leaves already beginning to wilt. I frowned, moving closer to investigate. The breaks didn't look like the work of any animal I knew. They were too high up for a deer, and too clean for a bear. It almost looked as if someone had deliberately snapped them off. But who would do that, and why? A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart suddenly racing. But it was just Dave, stumbling out of the RV with a murmured, "Good morning," and making a beeline for the coffee pot. I hesitated, then decided not to mention the broken branches. No need to worry Dave over what was probably nothing. Still, as we went about our morning routine, breakfast, cleaning up, planning our day, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We spent the day exploring the area around our campsite. There was a nice hiking trail that followed the creek upstream, winding through the forest and offering beautiful views of the surrounding mountains. Dave was in his element, pointing out various plants and birds, his earlier stress seeming to melt away in the face of nature's beauty. As we hiked, I found myself scanning the trees, looking for, well, I wasn't sure what. More broken branches, signs of large animals. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the uneasy feeling from the morning persisted, sitting in the pit of my stomach like a stone. We returned to the campsite late in the afternoon, tired but happy. Dave insisted on cooking dinner. He'd brought along some steaks he wanted to grill over the campfire. As the smell of cooking meat filled the air, I found myself relaxing. The unease of the morning seemed distant and silly in the face of good food and good company. After dinner, we sat by the fire again, nursing our beers and swapping old stories. The night was peaceful, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle burble of the creek. Then suddenly, a noise broke the silence. It was faint at first, a rustling in the underbrush, barely audible over the fire, but it grew louder, closer. It sounded like something large moving through the trees, just beyond the ring of firelight. Dave broke off mid-sentence, his eyes widening. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my earlier unease rushing back full force. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Probably just a deer or something." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The noise was too loud, too deliberate for a deer. Whatever was out there, it was big. We sat in tense silence, straining our ears. The rustling continued for a few more moments, then abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. "Maybe we should head in for the night," Dave suggested, his voice shaky. I agreed. and we quickly doused the fire and retreated to the safety of the RV. As I locked the door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night I dreamed of dark shapes moving through the trees, of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. I woke several times, sweating and disoriented, only to be lulled back to sleep by Dave's steady breathing in the familiar confines of the RV. When morning came again, I was exhausted. Dave didn't look much better. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he moved with the slow caution of someone nursing a hangover. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He nodded, rubbing his face. "Yeah, had some weird dreams. You?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Same here. Must be something in the air out here." We went about our morning routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. We both jumped at small noises, and I caught Dave scanning the tree line more than once, a worried frown on his face. As we were cleaning up after breakfast, Dave suddenly grabbed my arm. "Mike," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Look at the RV." I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, on the side of the RV, were long, deep scratches. They ran from near the ground all the way up to the windows, as if something huge had raked its claws down the side of the vehicle. "What the hell?" I muttered, moving closer to inspect the damage. The scratches were deep, gouging through the paint to the metal beneath. Whatever had made them was powerful. "We need to leave," Dave said, his voice shaking. "Now." Part of me wanted to agree to jump in the RV and drive away as fast as we could, but another part, the part that had faced down unruly teenagers for decades, rebelled at the idea of being scared away from our vacation. "Let's not overreact," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It was probably just a bear attracted by the smell of our dinner last night. We'll be more careful about food storage, and it'll leave us alone." Dave didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. "Okay," he said. "But if anything else happens, we're out of here. Deal?" "Deal," I agreed. We spent the rest of the day close to camp, neither of us willing to venture too far into the woods. We fished in the creek, played cards, and tried to pretend everything was normal. But we both kept glancing at the woods, jumping at every unexpected sound. As night fell, we decided to forego the campfire. Instead, we sat in the RV, playing cards by the light of the battery-powered lantern. Outside, the woods seemed to press closer, the darkness feeling almost alive. We were in the middle of a hand of gin rummy when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from right outside the RV. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human. Dave's cards fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "Mike," he whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. "What the hell is that?" I shook my head, my mouth too dry to speak. The growl came again, louder this time. Something bumped against the side of the RV, making the whole vehicle rock slightly. We sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The bumping continued, moving around the RV as if whatever it was circling us. Then, abruptly, it stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, from right outside the window came a sound that chilled me to my very core. It was a laugh. A deep, rumbling laugh that sounded almost but not quite human. Dave and I looked at each other, our faces mirrors of terror. Whatever was out there, we both knew one thing for certain. It wasn't a bear. The laughter faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. Dave and I sat motionless, hardly daring to breathe. The battery-powered lantern cast long shadows across the interior of the RV, turning familiar shapes into looming monsters. "What do we do?" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to start the RV and drive away as fast as we could. But another part, the part that had faced down unruly students and angry parents over the years, rebelled at the idea of running away from an unseen threat. "We wait," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever it is, it can't get in here. We're safe as long as we stay inside." Dave nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew that the thin walls of the Dave nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew that the thin walls of the RV weren't much protection if whatever was out there really wanted to get in. We sat in tense silence for what felt like hours, straining our ears for any sound of movement outside. Occasionally we'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, sending fresh waves of fear through us. But the laughter didn't come again, nor did the growling or the bumping against the RV. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, we finally allowed ourselves to relax slightly. Dave had dozed off in his chair, his head lolling at an uncomfortable angle. I envied him his ability to sleep, even in these circumstances. I had remained awake all night, my eyes fixed on the door, my hands clenched around a heavy flashlight I had grabbed as a makeshift weapon. When the sun had fully risen, I gently shook Dave awake. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's check outside." Dave blinked awake, confusion giving way to remembrance, and then fear as the events of the night came back to him. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I wasn't sure at all, but I knew we couldn't stay in the RV forever. "We'll be careful," I promised. "Just a quick look around." Slowly, cautiously, we opened the RV door and stepped outside. The morning was beautiful, crisp and clear, with no sign of the terror we had experienced during the night. Birds were singing, the creek was burbling peacefully, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. But as we walked around the RV, we saw evidence that last night hadn't been a dream or a shared hallucination. There were deep impressions in the soft ground around the RV, huge, misshapen footprints that looked almost, but not quite, human. And on the side of the RV, in addition to the scratches we had noticed before, there was now a smear of some dark, foul-smelling substance. Dave leaned in to examine it, then recoiled quickly. "God, what is that?" he gagged. I shook my head, fighting back my own wave of nausea. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. We need to leave, Dave, now." This time there was no argument. We quickly packed up our campsite, our earlier careful organization replaced by a frantic need to get away as quickly as possible. Within an hour we were on the road, the RV bouncing along the dirt track that led back to the main highway. As we drove, Dave and I discussed what to do next. We both agreed that we needed to report what had happened, but we were less certain about who to tell. The police? The Forest Service? Would anyone even believe us? In the end, we decided to stop at the ranger station near the entrance to Shoshone National Forest. The ranger on duty, a weathered-looking man in his 50s named John Hawkins, listened to our story with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. When we finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes flickering between Dave and me as if trying to gauge our sincerity. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You boys aren't the first to come in here with a story like that," he said quietly. Dave and I exchanged surprised glances. "You mean, this has happened before?" I asked. Ranger Hawkins nodded slowly. "We get a few reports every year. Campers hearing strange noises, seeing footprints, that sort of thing. Most folks write it off as bears or mountain lions, but..." He trailed off, his gaze distant. "But what?" Dave pressed. The ranger seemed to shake himself out of his reverie. "But there are stories," he said. "Old stories passed down by the Shoshone people who lived in these parts long before us. They talk about a creature that lives in the deepest parts of the forest. Something that's not quite animal, not quite human." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the laughter we had heard. That terrible, almost human laugh. "What do they call it?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. "The Shoshone have a name for it," Ranger Hawkins said, "but most folks around here just call it the Jaeger." "The Jaeger," Dave repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. What is it supposed to be?" The ranger shrugged. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's a type of Bigfoot. Others think it's something older, something that was here long before humans came to these parts. All the stories agree on one thing, though. It's dangerous, cunning, and it doesn't like people in its territory." We left the ranger station with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of unease. Dave and I agreed to head back to Denver immediately, neither of us feeling up to continuing our camping trip after what we had experienced. The drive back was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about the Jaeger, about those footprints and that terrible laughter. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, as the product of overactive imaginations and too many campfire stories. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen, and I knew that whatever was out there in the Shoshone National Forest, it was very, very real. We arrived back in Denver late that night. Dave and I said our goodbyes, promising to keep in touch, but as the days turned into weeks and then months, we spoke less and less. It was as if by not talking about what had happened, we could pretend it had never occurred at all. Life went on. I threw myself into my retirement activities, volunteering, gardening, the occasional substitute teaching gig. But the memory of that night in the woods never fully left me. Sometimes late at night I would wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman laughter ringing in my ears. 5 years passed. I had almost convinced myself that the whole incident had been some sort of shared delusion, a product of stress and an unfamiliar environment. Then, one crisp autumn morning, I received a call that would shatter that comforting illusion forever. It was Dave's wife, Susan. Her voice was thick with tears as she told me the news. Dave had gone missing during a solo camping trip in the Shoshone National Forest. As Susan spoke, describing how Dave had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his trip, how he had become obsessed with researching local legends and folklore, I felt a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I knew with a certainty that defied rational explanation that Dave had gone back to look for the Jaeger, and I knew with equal certainty that I had to go find him. The next day, I loaded up my old RV and set out for Wyoming. As I drove, memories of that night 5 years ago came flooding back. The scratches on the RV, the footprints in the mud, that terrible mocking laughter. But this time, I wasn't going in unprepared. I had spent the night researching everything I could find about the Jaeger and the legends surrounding it. I had packed supplies, weapons, and every piece of camping and survival gear I owned. As I crossed the state line into Wyoming, I glanced at myself in the rearview mirror. The face that looked back at me was older, more lined, but set with a determination I hadn't felt in years. "I'm coming, Dave," I muttered to myself. "And this time, we're going to get answers." Little did I know that the answers I sought would be far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The creature that waited for me in the depths of the Shoshone National Forest was more than just a legend, more than just a monster. It was something ancient, something primal, something that had been waiting a very long time for someone like me to come looking for it. As I drove deeper into Wyoming, the sun setting behind me and the forests looming ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving towards my destiny. Whether that destiny would bring salvation or doom, only time would tell. But one thing was certain, the Jaeger was waiting. And this time, there would be no escape. The familiar landscape of Wyoming rolled by outside my RV window, but this time, the beauty of the rugged terrain was lost on me. My mind was consumed with worry for Dave and apprehension about what lay ahead. I had called Susan before leaving Denver, promising her that I would do everything in my power to find Dave. She had given me what little information she had, the name of the campground where Dave had last been seen, the date he was supposed to return. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. As I neared the turnoff for Shoshone National Forest, I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. The memories of our last trip here were still vivid, despite the years that had passed. I could almost hear that inhuman laughter echoing in my ears. I pulled into the ranger station, hoping to speak with Ranger Hawkins again. But the man behind the desk was younger, probably in his early 30s. His name tag read, Mark Thompson. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked politely as I approached. I explained the situation as best I could, trying to strike a balance between urgency and not sounding like a complete lunatic. To his credit, Ranger Thompson listened attentively, his brow furrowing with concern. "We did have a report of a missing camper," he said when I finished. "A David Whitman. Is that your friend?" I nodded, a mix of relief and dread washing over me. Relief that Dave's disappearance had been noted, dread at the confirmation that he was indeed missing. Ranger Thompson pulled out a map of the forest, spreading it out on the desk between us. "Mr. Whitman's car was found here," he said, pointing to a spot near a campground. "We've had search parties out every day, but so far we haven't found any sign of him." I leaned in, studying the map. The campground was close to where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. Too close to be a coincidence, I was sure. "I'd like to join the search," I said. Ranger Thompson looked at me doubtfully. Sir, I appreciate your concern for your friend, but our search and rescue teams are trained professionals. It might be better if you left this to them. I shook my head firmly. I'm going out there, with or without your blessing. I know these woods, and I know Dave. I might see something your teams would miss. The ranger sighed, recognizing the determination in my voice. All right, he said reluctantly, but please be careful. These woods can be dangerous, especially if you're not prepared. If only he knew how dangerous, I thought grimly. I spent the rest of the day preparing for my search. I stocked up on supplies, studied the map Ranger Thompson had given me, and tried to recall everything I could about our previous trip and the legend of the Jaeger. As night fell, I parked my RV at the campground where Dave's car had been found. The place was quiet, most of the other campers having left due to the search activity. I was grateful for the solitude. It would make it easier for me to conduct my own investigation without raising suspicion. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound from the forest outside set my nerves on edge. Was it just the wind in the trees or something more sinister? As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When dawn finally broke, I was already up and ready to go. I packed a day bag with water, food, a first aid kit, and other essentials. After a moment's hesitation, I also included the old revolver I had brought with me. I wasn't sure it would be much use against the Jaeger if the legends were true, but its weight was reassuring nonetheless. I set out just as the sun was cresting the horizon, the forest around me still shrouded in early morning mist. I had a general idea of where I wanted to go, the area where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. It was a hunch, but it was all I had to go on. As I hiked, I kept my senses alert for any sign of Dave or anything unusual, but the forest seemed peaceful, almost eerily so. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had been walking for several hours when I found the first sign that I was on the right track. There, half hidden by a bush, was a scrap of fabric. I recognized it immediately. It was from the jacket Dave had been wearing in the photo Susan had shown me. My heart pounding, I pushed deeper into the forest. The terrain was becoming rougher, the trees growing closer together. I was pretty sure I had left the marked trails behind some time ago. Then, as I rounded a large boulder, I saw it. The clearing where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. It looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow. But there was no mistaking it, and there in the center of the clearing was a tent. Dave's tent. I approached cautiously, calling out Dave's name, but there was no response. The clearing was silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. The tent was empty, but it showed signs of a struggle. The fabric was torn in several places, and Dave's sleeping bag was half pulled out of the entrance, as if he had been dragged from the tent. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my hand going to the revolver at my hip. There, at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. For a moment I thought it was Dave, but as my eyes focused, I realized with a jolt of terror that it was something else entirely. It was tall, far taller than any man, its body covered in matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence, and its mouth was stretched in a terrible, mocking grin. The Jaeger. It was real, and it was here. As I stood frozen in shock and fear, the creature threw back its head and laughed, that same chilling laugh I had heard 5 years ago. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and vanished into the forest. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. But eventually I managed to shake off my paralysis. I knew I should leave, should run back to the ranger station and report what I had seen. But Dave was still out there somewhere, and now I knew for certain what had taken him. With shaking hands, I checked my revolver, making sure it was loaded. Then, taking a deep breath to steady myself, I plunged into the forest after the Jaeger. I was no longer just searching for my friend. I was hunting a monster, and I had a terrible feeling that it was hunting me too. The forest seemed to close in around me as I moved deeper into its depths, following the path the Jaeger had taken. The trees here were old, their gnarled branches reaching out like grasping fingers, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the musty scent of decaying leaves and something else, something rank and animal. I tried to move as quietly as possible, but every snapping twig under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the eerie silence. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, my hand never straying far from the revolver at my hip. The weight of the gun was reassuring, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind wondered if it would be any use against a creature like the Jaeger. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I pushed on. The forest all looked the same. Endless trees, patches of undergrowth, the occasional boulder or fallen log. I began to fear that I was walking in circles, that I would never find my way out again. Then, just as despair was beginning to set in, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, impaled on a broken branch at about eye level, was a scrap of cloth. As I moved closer, my heart sinking, I recognized it as a piece of Dave's shirt. It was stained dark with what could only be blood. Fighting back a wave of nausea, I forced myself to examine the area more closely. There were other signs of disturbance. Broken branches, scuff marks in the dirt, more drops of blood. It looked like something large had been dragged through here. With a grim determination, I continued to follow the trail. The signs of passage became more pronounced. Deep gouges in the tree trunks, tufts of coarse hair caught on thorny bushes, and an increasingly strong musky odor that made my nose wrinkle in disgust. As I pressed on, the forest began to change. The trees grew more twisted and misshapen, their bark blackened as if by some ancient fire. The ground beneath my feet became soggy and treacherous, each step accompanied by a sickening squelch. I realized I was entering a swampy area, one that wasn't marked on any of the maps I had studied. The light was fading fast now, the gloom of twilight settling over the forest like a shroud. I knew I should turn back, that continuing on in the growing darkness was madness. But the thought of Dave alone and at the mercy of that creature spurred me onward. It was then that I heard it, a low, keening wail that echoed through the trees. It was a sound of pain, of desperation, and it was unmistakably human. "Dave!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. "Dave, where are you?" The wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from somewhere ahead of me, I heard a weak voice call out, "Mike, is that you? Oh God, Mike, help me!" It was Dave. He was alive. I surged forward, my fatigue forgotten in a rush of adrenaline. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and tore at my clothes. All that mattered was reaching Dave. I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt, my eyes struggling to make sense of what I was seeing in the dim light. In the center of the clearing was a crude structure, a sort of nest made from broken branches and what looked horribly like human bones. And there, half buried in the debris, was Dave. He looked terrible. His clothes were in tatters, his body covered in cuts and bruises. One of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. But he was alive, and as he saw me, his eyes lit up with a desperate hope. "Mike," he gasped, you actually came." I rushed to his side, my hands shaking as I began to pull away the branches covering him. "Of course I came," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I couldn't leave you out here. Come on, we need to get you out of here before—" A low, rumbling growl cut me off mid-sentence. I froze, then slowly turned around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the Jaeger. In the fading light, it seemed even more monstrous than before. Its massive body was covered in matted fur, caked with mud, and what I prayed wasn't blood. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a protruding snout and yellowed, pointed teeth. But its eyes were the worst part. They glowed with an eerie intelligence, filled with a malevolence that was all too human. For a long moment we stared at each other, neither moving. Then with a roar that shook the very ground, the Jaeger charged. I didn't think, I just reacted. I drew my revolver and fired, the sound of the shots deafening in the enclosed space of the clearing. The Jaeger staggered, dark blood blossoming on its chest, but it didn't go down. If anything, the wounds only seemed to enrage it further. With a speed that belied its size, the creature closed the distance between us. I managed to squeeze off one more shot before it was upon me, its massive paws swatting the gun from my hand as if it were a toy. The impact sent me sprawling, and I tasted blood as my head struck the ground. Through a haze of pain, I saw the Jaeger looming over me, its foul breath hot on my face as it prepared to deliver the killing blow. In that moment, facing what I was sure was my death, a strange calm settled over me. I thought of my life, of the people I loved, of Dave lying injured just a few feet away, and I knew I couldn't give up. With a yell that surprised even me, I surged upward, driving my fist into the Jaeger's throat. It was like punching a brick wall, but the creature reared back, momentarily stunned. It was all the opening I needed. I scrambled to my feet and lunged for my fallen revolver. My fingers closed around the grip just as the Jaeger recovered and charged again. I rolled onto my back, brought the gun up, and emptied the remaining chambers into the creature's face. The Jaeger's roar of rage turned into a shriek of pain. It thrashed wildly, its massive body convulsing as it fought against the bullets tearing through its skull. Then, with a final earth-shaking bellow, it collapsed. For several long moments I lay there, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The clearing was silent save for my ragged breathing and Dave's quiet whimpers of pain. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. The Jaeger lay motionless, dark blood pooling beneath its massive head. I approached cautiously, the gun still trained on its body, but there was no need. The creature was dead. I turned back to Dave, my hand shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. "It's over," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "It's really over." The next few hours passed in a blur. Somehow I managed to get Dave free from the nest and support him as we made our slow, painful way back through the forest. It was full dark by the time we reached the edge of the woods, but there were lights ahead, flashlights bobbing in the darkness. The search party found us just as Dave's strength gave out. I remember collapsing to my knees, still holding on to my friend, as voices shouted and hands reached out to help us. The aftermath was a whirlwind of hospitals, police interviews, and media attention. Dave's story of abduction by an unknown creature made headlines, but without any concrete evidence. The Jaeger's body had vanished by the time a search team made it back to the clearing. It was eventually written off as the delusions of a man who had suffered a traumatic experience. As for me, I told a carefully edited version of events, leaving out any mention of the Jaeger. Who would have believed me anyway? In time, the furor died down, and life began to return to normal. But I knew the truth. I had seen the Jaeger with my own eyes, had felt its hot breath on my face, had watched it die. And sometimes late at night I find myself wondering, was it really the only one of its kind? Or are there more creatures out there, hiding in the dark places of the world, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble into their domain? I don't go camping anymore. The call of the wild has lost its appeal for me. But every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving where no shadow should be. A flash of glowing eyes in the darkness. And I'll remember that night in the Shoshone National Forest and the monster I faced there. The Jaeger may be gone, but its memory lives on. And in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, who knows what other secrets are waiting to be discovered. As I sit here, an old man now, recounting this story, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. The world is a mysterious place, full of wonders and terrors beyond our understanding. And sometimes, just sometimes, those terrors have teeth and claws, and a laugh that echoes through the night, calling to something primitive and fearful, deep within us all. So the next time you're in the woods, and you hear a twig snap behind you, or see a shadow move in the corner of your eye, remember my story, remember the Jaeger, and whatever you do, don't look back, because you never know what might be gaining on you in the darkness.